Hi, everybody. Okay, so I'm here to talk about the Afromodernist Diaries, identity and architecture. So what is an African building? When we think of this idea of what it means to be African, I think all of us understand or have an idea of what we consider an African building to be, and it usually tends to be the idea of rural vernacular. This is a typical village that was in Oyo. It had to be rebuilt in Abeokuta after a series of wars. But this is a typical example of what we understand it to be, to mean, to be African. It's a series of simple structures put together as a collective, usually with a central court in the middle where they would have village meetings. But in terms of its individuality, the buildings are small. Simple structures to create shelter, allow for cooling, allow for light where necessary, to carry out rudimentary village life activities of taking care of children, cooking in a collective, going to the farm, and so on. Or, what do we then consider to be our urban vernacular? So we're going from this idea of rural into urban. We're moving from villages into cities. Now, what a lot of people consider to be our vernacular, our urban vernacular, is the Brazilian style. This was brought back by the Agundas, the Brazilian returnees who came back in the early 1800s after slavery. Now, personally, I don't feel that these represent what it means to be African, purely because they're an imported style. They were not influenced from the bottom up. They are not indigenous. But to your average Nigerian, they are, because they really don't understand where it's come from. This type of housing has populated a lot of southwestern Nigeria. You have it from Ibadan to Abeokuta to Lagos, and even in the east here. It was seen as a style of affluence. So what do we consider as our urban civic? Recently, last year, July, my office completed Maryland Mall on Ikorodu Road. This building doesn't fit the standard typology of what a shopping mall in Nigeria is, because predominantly what we've had come in has actually been provided by the South African architects. The building in itself is a completely unique design, but was appropriate for its use. But the criticism that I've had on this building is it really African? Then we look at this idea of modernism. What is modernism? It was a philosophical movement that manifested in architecture, art, and design, predominantly in the 1900s. But in terms of architecture and urbanism in Africa, it has a funny tension. So this image here is done by a lady called Nancy Wolfe, who is an American artist who came into Nigeria in the 1980s when her husband came to teach at the University of Nigeria. And in this image, she depicts this idea of the tension that exists between modernization and vernacular culture. So you can see the village hut in relation to the planned mass housing and the tension that exists between the two. This other image here shows who are we, the question of identity. You can see a Manhattan-type skyline in the background, and you can see a masquerade standing looking confused. We have this awkward tension that exists between the then and the now. So modernism, how does it all start? Everything really started with industrialization. Industrialization started in the early 1700s, where it was the opportunity to take the world from being farmers and hunters into being able to mass produce using technology and shifting the world from towns into actual cities. But this came with connotations. Industrialization was supported by slavery because initially, before the technology was advanced enough, it was about having mass humans being able to produce on large scale. Following slave trade came colonization, where there was a scramble for the African continent. And followed by that, we then have this idea of modernism. So it's important we understand this linear process. Now, this is a map of Africa as we understand it today, with our boundary lines between states. But it wasn't always like this. These are the empires that existed between the 1300s to the 1600s. We had trade between empire states, trading in ivory, trading in minerals, copper, trading in clothes, and there was a lot of intertrading between these different empires. And then we had the shift. And this was really where it all went wrong. In the 1500s, when the Europeans came in and they started trading towards the South Atlantic and taking slaves out. And there were 15 million slaves that were exported from the continent from 1500s to 1900s. And so in the 1800s, late 1800s, this is what they had. This was the scramble for Africa. And this shows you the colonization pattern that existed. So predominant players were Britain, France, Portugal, Germany, and Spain. And there were only 2 countries that were not colonized in Africa: Liberia and Ethiopia. Liberia predominantly was the place where returnee slaves were allocated land from the United States of America. But Ethiopia was never colonized by any state. There was a short spell where Italy tried to take occupation, but it didn't hold. But culturally, they're the most advanced on the continent. Now, the reason why this is important is because here, there's this idea of, the nation states that were created from Africa, first by colonization and then opposing forces. We've been molded together, not out of our intent, but by the powers that were imposed on us. So when I talk about this idea of understanding where we're coming from, this sculpture is known as Tada, and it's the earliest sculpture that has been carbon dated from Ile-Ife. It's considered to be from 1325 to 1360. You can imagine the capacity or the skill that existed at that time. And then it makes you think about how much has actually been lost. Now, I want to show you a video, and I will explain it after it's been.
Stand up. I don't know about that. Moses. Yes, President.
Allah Akbar. It's easy. Nobody sit down for one place. Oh, they talk this thing like, hey, block that place.
Okay, the reason why I showed that is my understanding of what we just watched. There were 2 videos. You've watched the second one. The first one was a representation of a setting where someone is accused of committing a crime, and they have sworn that they were not the ones. If you lift up the basket and the feathers are flat, it means that you're innocent. If you lift it up and the feathers stand, then you're guilty. The reason why I'm showing this is that before colonization, we had systems in place that acted for law, that acted, if you had a problem, you would go to an oracle. But when colonization came in, we were told to understand that our culture was wrong. Everything that we had in terms of our religion was pushed to the side. And to be honest, where you see situations like that happen now, it's considered as fringe culture. I'm not here necessarily to give credit to that situation or give credit to the systems that we move with now. But it's more the acknowledgement that in us developing with the way the world expected us to, we've actually lost a lot. And so with that, I come up with these ideas of what if. Here, I'm going to talk about island evolution Island evolution occurs when mammals become either dwarfed or giants because of lack of external forces. A typical example of this is the dodo bird. This has become now extinct. It lived on the island of Mauritius, and in the 1600s, late 1600s, it became extinct when the foreigners or the Europeans came in on the island. The bird did not have the ability to fly because in reality, it didn't need to. But when the influencers came in, the bird couldn't fly. It was easy prey. And though it wasn't a tasty bird, its gizzard was quite nice. And because of that, they were called in masses, and the bird doesn't exist anymore. So this is a typical example of an animal that lived in isolation, was able to evolve to a state, but when an external force came in, it couldn't move forward. And so I relate this now with the situation of Africa and still give other examples. You have a book that was written called Freakonomics. And in Freakonomics, they made an assumption, and I'll just read it out now. On average, children born in 1967, just after abortion, became illegal, displayed better education and labor market achievements than children born prior to the change. This outcome can be explained by a change in the composition of women having children. They actually noticed in the US that they had a drop in the crime rate in the 1980s, and it really was because a whole generation were never born. So it now makes you think about situations that exist. This is a study that was done by an artist called Christina Miller called Afronauts. There was actually a research teacher in Namibia who set up a science program to take astronauts from Africa into space. And this is an idea of, what if we had had a linear evolution without any external forces? Would we have become more advanced than we are? Would you have had astronauts wearing patterns very similar to the tessellations that exist in African cities, or in our patterns or in our cultures? And then I think as well, what if the Agundas didn't come back? What if they didn't bring their style of architecture with them? Would we have a completely different identity to what we have now? And then I think culturally, there are certain things that have stayed with us. This is a village in the east, and you can see here the very high-pitched roof, which is quite significant to show the idea of presence and establishment. If you look at a modern house in the east today, you still have that coronation that exists, even in a modern building. That hasn't been because there's been a linear process, but culturally there have been certain aspects that have stayed with us. So what is a modernist African building? We can't look at that without looking at this idea of post-colonial modernism in Africa. In general, Africa as a continent, we embraced post-colonialism. We're trying to create established, iconic buildings to show that we had arrived, that we had come of age. There was a growth in terms of civic buildings, theaters, hospitals, state institution buildings, but in many cases across the continent in general, those buildings were not planned with long-term infrastructure. And this is a typical example of a building in Ghana where you can now see, we've gone backwards and you have people using the space now to hang their clothes. But there was great intent in terms of modernism, but it wasn't necessarily created by Africans, not African architects. A lot of the foreign architects that came in the 1950s and 60s were trained in the West, but they were taught the principles of tropical architecture to ensure that the buildings that they were designing would consider light and consider ventilation being passively placed. And so this is an example of a building in Ibadan that was done by Friar Otto and Nancy Drew. But then we look at this idea of how did the African actually contribute towards this? The first architect in Nigeria was called Olamuyiwa. He studied at Manchester School of Architecture, and he was the first person to come back and set up private practice. I read an interview with him, and he also questioned this idea of how to really make a building African, or an African modernist building. And to be honest, he didn't really answer the question, but he did consider the spaces that we occupy. For example, a lot of the houses that he designed, he was conscious of the fact that we had several levels of public and private living rooms because of the number of guests that you would receive for maybe weddings or funerals, which you wouldn't necessarily have had in a modernist European or Western building. And then I'm going to look at two architects to kind of buttress this point. We have Mokume, who is very well celebrated as an artist, sculptor, and architect. And here is an example of the museum that the Dominican chapel that was done in Ibadan. Now, some parties will consider this to be a modernist building. But in my concern here is that he has emphasized a lot of ornamentation, which doesn't sit necessarily well with modernism. Modernism is about creating buildings of simplicity, true to forms, plain lines, and true to material. But he's one of the first in our country to really push this idea of being able to create something that is African. The next architect I would like to speak about is Francis Cary. Francis Cary is from Burkina Faso. He grew up in a village, and he had designed a village school, which has been very well celebrated internationally. Very conscious of materiality and ensuring that he created a building that is appropriate for its environment, conscious of sustainability, and being able to be maintained by the local community, but also aesthetically pushing the boundaries of what we should consider architecture to be. And because of this, he was given the commission to produce the Serpentine Pavilion in London, in Hyde Park, this year. Now, this building is one that is done once a year. It's a temporary structure done in the park. There have been 17 architects who have produced pavilions since 2000, and he was the first from our continent to be able to produce a building here. But what's so beautiful is that he brought a sensibility of being African to this space, conscious of this idea of the village collective, the collection of light, and even, again, looking at this idea of patterning and structure that is so prevalent in our culture. Now, the question that a lot of people have is, will he be able to translate this into a building on a much larger scale? Now, what is our identity? Let's take it away from buildings. Here we have an image of Ankara, and we have an image of Ashoke. A lot of people feel that Ankara is actually African, but it's not. Ankara was actually set up by the Dutch as a cheap imitation to Indonesian damask. It was intended for the Indonesian market, but it didn't take up there. It was somehow absorbed by Africans who took it forward and celebrated it. Whereas you have Ashoke, which is actually indigenous to this environment. Ankara has become part of our tradition, but it's actually not our culture. Then you look at people who are beginning to celebrate this idea of African and really bring it into their work. And here is some stuff that is done by a company called Da, where they produce utensils for kitchens. And the one on the left is the omorogun, which is a typical utensil that exists in any African kitchen, which is used to stir jollof rice and scratch the burnt rice from the bottom of the pot. But here he's taken that sensibility and started to create clean contemporary pieces that are appropriate for the international market. This is one of our chairs that we've recently produced as well from our furniture line in Elias, where we're looking at using beautifully made pieces from Nigeria using local fabrics. Here is Atelier. And this next one is the use of Ashoke to create a very clean contemporary armchair. These are pieces that are done by a company in Ghana, and this is by Moa Designs, who also look at pottery and push this idea of collective patterning that exists. This is done by a Nigerian product designer, Damola Rufai, where he takes materials that he's able to find locally to create interesting geometries and push the idea of what we consider to be good products. This is another piece that shows, again, using modern materials, but weaving in that idea, that very African patterning that exists. And so we then ask ourselves, 70% of the world's population is expected to live in cities by 2050. Half of them will be in Africa, and they will be under 30. We have moved from rural to urban. As we move, we have a clear narrative of what we consider rural vernacular, but what do we consider as our urban civic architecture? Here is a study that I'm doing with a very famous artist, Victor Ekemone, where we're beginning to look and explore this idea of what does it really mean to be African. And this is really a self-portrait, conscious of my personal features and how they're also expressing a lot of the art that exists from our continent, whether it's art that's been produced today or art that was produced from the 1300s. So we go back to this idea of Francis Cary's building. and what he's been able to create in terms of his identity and his buildings. And I think something that's quite interesting is that though he might have created an architecture that seems more rural or small scale, Africa being the last frontier is really the last place on earth where things are truly human. Where we live in an environment now where everything is artificial environments, where you have cities being developed, where everything is being controlled, it's an opportunity for us to step back and actually look at the way things were done and see how we can add value to where we're going. We have a unique opportunity as Africans. Because of the advance of technology, we've been able to jump many steps. We have to consciously make sure that we push the boundaries further. And I will leave you with a statement from Wole Soyinka. There is only one home to the life of the river mussel. There is only one home to the life of a tortoise. There is only one shell to the soul of a man. There is only one world in the spirit of our race. If that world leaves its course and smashes all boulders of the great void, whose world will give us shelter? Let us know who we are. Thank you.